Welcome to Dreamy History. Here's what makes no sense about the Victorian era. It was a time of unprecedented progress and unimaginable squalor, of rigid morality and rampant vice, of scientific rationalism and fervent spiritualism. It gave us the steam engine, the telegraph, germ theory and public health. Yet it tolerated child labour in mines and factories, housed millions in disease-ridden slums, and believed in phrenology and seances. It was the age of empire, the era when Britannia truly ruled the waves. But it was also a period of profound self-doubt, social unrest, and intellectual upheaval that questioned everything from God to the very structure of society. How could one century, one single reign, contain such staggering contradictions? It's a paradox wrapped in a bustle, an enigma shrouded in smog, and it shaped the modern world in ways we're still grappling with today. This wasn't just a period of history, it was a crucible where the future was forged, often brutally, always dramatically. It's endlessly fascinating because it holds up a mirror to our own complexities, showing us how innovation and injustice can thrive side by side, how grand visions can be built on the backs of the exploited, and how an entire society can cling to tradition while hurtling headlong into the future. If you're enjoying this journey through history, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And I'm always curious, drop a comment letting me know what city and time zone you're watching from. There's something special about knowing this story is reaching people all over the world. Let's start with the obvious question nobody asks. When we say Victorian, what exactly do we mean? Most people picture gas lamps, corsets, and perhaps a stern-looking queen. But the reality is far more complex, and it begins on June 20th, 1837, with an 18-year-old girl named Alexandrina Victoria. She was roused from her sleep at Kensington Palace by the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain, informing her that her uncle, King William IV, had died. She was now queen. Think about this for a second. A young woman, barely out of childhood, suddenly inheriting the throne of a nation on the cusp of truly dizzying change. This wasn't just a change of monarch. It was the dawn of an entire era, one that would redefine Britain and, by extension, much of the world. The Britain Victoria inherited was a nation in flux, a chaotic, vibrant, and often brutal place. It was the tail end of the Georgian era, a period characterized by aristocratic excesses, political corruption, and the first rumblings of the Industrial Revolution. The population was exploding, particularly in the northern manufacturing towns like Manchester and Birmingham. In 1801, Britain's population was around 10.5 million. By 1831, it had soared to 16.5 million, a staggering 57% increase in just 3 decades. This wasn't just more people, it was people moving, migrating from the rural countryside to the burgeoning industrial centres, seeking work in the new textile mills and coal mines. These cities were growing at an unprecedented rate, but without any planning or adequate infrastructure. The political landscape was equally unsettled. Just 5 years prior, in 1832, the Great Reform Act had passed, a landmark piece of legislation that expanded the voting franchise, though still only to a minority of wealthy men, and redistributed parliamentary seats, giving more representation to those new industrial towns. This was a direct response to widespread public unrest and fears of revolution, echoing the events across the Channel in France. The Whig Party, led by Prime Minister Lord Melbourne, was in power, generally seen as the more progressive of the two major parties, though still very much rooted in the aristocracy. They were grappling with issues like poverty, public health, and the burgeoning Chartist movement, which demanded universal male suffrage and other radical reforms. Victoria herself was, by all accounts, quite unprepared for the role. She had been raised in relative isolation under the Kensington system, a strict regime designed by her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and her comptroller, Sir John Conroy, to keep her dependent and controllable. She had never been alone, never slept in her own room, and certainly never had much say in her own life. Yet, on that morning of June 20th, she immediately asserted her authority. Her first act as queen was to send her mother's bed out of her room. This is where it gets genuinely interesting. This young woman, seen by many as a naive figurehead, possessed an iron will that would define her reign. She was determined to be a proper queen, not merely a puppet. The immediate challenges facing the young queen and her government were immense. The economy, while industrializing, was far from stable. The Hungry 40s were just around the corner, a decade of widespread famine and economic depression that would test the nation's resilience. The Corn Laws, protectionist tariffs on imported grain, kept bread prices high, benefiting wealthy landowners but causing immense suffering among the working classes. This economic tension fueled social unrest, giving rise to movements like Chartism, a truly mass movement that presented petitions to Parliament signed by millions, demanding fundamental democratic reforms. These weren't quiet protests, these were massive demonstrations, sometimes involving clashes with authorities, driven by genuine desperation. And about the society itself, it was a place of stark contrasts. For the wealthy elite, life was refined, elegant, and often decadent, filled with grand country estates, lavish balls, and intricate social rituals. But venture just a few blocks from the glittering West End of London, and you'd find yourself in unimaginable squalor. Thousands of people lived in overcrowded tenements, often without sanitation, clean water, or adequate food. Cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis were rampant, sweeping through these communities with terrifying regularity. The average life expectancy in some urban areas was barely 20 years. Child labour was not just common, but essential for many families to survive, with children as young as 5 working long, dangerous hours in factories, mines, and as chimney sweeps. This is a detail most people miss. The foundation of Victorian prosperity was often built on the suffering of its most vulnerable citizens. The intellectual climate was also a fascinating mix. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and science was gaining ground, but traditional religious belief remained incredibly strong. The Church of England was still the established church, but various nonconformist Protestant denominations were growing, often linked to social reform movements. Darwin's On the Origin of Species was still 2 decades away, but geological discoveries were already challenging biblical literalism, creating a quiet tension between faith and emerging scientific understanding. This era was grappling with the fundamental questions of human existence, purpose, and society, even as it was building the infrastructure of a global empire. Victoria's early reign, then, was characterized by a delicate balancing act. She had to navigate a complex political system, manage a powerful Prime Minister in Lord Melbourne who became a father figure, and project an image of stability and moral uprightness to a nation yearning for both. Her youth and perceived innocence actually helped, offering a fresh start after the unpopular reigns of her uncles. She wasn't tainted by the scandals and excesses of the Georgians. She represented a new chapter, a chance for the monarchy to reconnect with its people, even as the country faced unprecedented challenges. The seeds of radical change were already sown, and the young queen would spend the next 63 years presiding over their astonishing, often turbulent growth. And we're only getting started. The accession of Queen Victoria was merely the overture to a symphony of innovation, empire, social transformation, and stark contradiction. In our next chapter, we'll delve into the early years of her marriage to Prince Albert, the burgeoning industrial might, and the incredible, almost unbelievable event that truly showcased Britain's arrival on the world stage, the Great Exhibition of 1851. But that's a story for the next chapter, as the young queen and her consort began to truly stamp their mark on the century. We left young Alexandrina Victoria, an untested queen, asserting her will the very night she ascended the throne, banishing the imposing bed of her controlling mother, the Duchess of Kent, from her chambers. It was a potent symbol, wasn't it? A clear declaration that this 18-year-old, isolated and sheltered, was no one's puppet. But while she could command her private space, the kingdom she inherited was a far more unruly beast, demanding a different kind of mastery. For those initial years, Victoria leaned heavily on Lord Melbourne, her Whig Prime Minister. He was, to all intents and purposes, the father figure she'd never truly had, a shrewd worldly politician who patiently guided her through the labyrinthine corridors of statecraft. We see her eagerly absorbing his lessons, poring over dispatches and attending endless council meetings. She was quick, sharp, and possessed an astonishing memory, rapidly moving from a naive girl to a monarch with a burgeoning understanding of her constitutional role. It was a fascinating apprenticeship, watching a kitten, as some called her, transform into a lioness, albeit one still finding her raw. But the political landscape was treacherous, even for an experienced hand like Melbourne. His Whig government, though progressive in some respects, was losing ground. And then, in 1839, came one of Victoria's first major tests, a moment that truly solidified her burgeoning independence and perhaps revealed a touch of partisan stubbornness: the bedchamber crisis. Melbourne's government, weakened by Irish issues and colonial unrest, faced a vote of no confidence. He resigned, leaving Victoria in a precarious position. Traditionally, the incoming Prime Minister, in this case the formidable Conservative leader Sir Robert Peel, would expect to appoint his own household staff, particularly the ladies of the bedchamber, who were more than just personal attendants. They were politically connected women from influential families. But Victoria, fiercely loyal to Melbourne and the Whigs, refused. She saw her ladies as personal friends, not political pawns, and believed Peel was demanding she dismiss them as an affront. Can you imagine the uproar? A young queen, barely out of her teens, defying the established political order. We watched as she stood firm, declaring she would not submit to a system which will not be for my honour. Peel, for his part, refused to take office under such conditions, feeling he couldn't govern effectively if the Queen's intimate circle was openly hostile to his party. The result? A political impasse. Melbourne, though reluctant, was eventually persuaded to return as Prime Minister, his government limping on for a further 2 years. This crisis was a pivotal moment. It showed us Victoria's iron will, her determination to protect her prerogatives, and her burgeoning sense of royal dignity. Yet it also highlighted her political inexperience and strong partisan leanings, a trait she would eventually temper. For the public, it was a dramatic spectacle, a young woman challenging the old guard, and it certainly cemented her image as a monarch of character, even if some found her actions headstrong. She was learning, often publicly, that being queen was a delicate dance between personal will and constitutional duty. Meanwhile, beyond the gilded cages of Kensington and Buckingham Palaces, the nation itself was in a deepening crisis. As the 1830s bled into the 1840s, Britain plunged into what became grimly known as the Hungry Forties. This wasn't merely a period of economic downturn, it was an era of profound suffering, where the very foundations of society seemed to groan under the weight of an exploding population and an unforgiving industrial system. We saw factories, the symbols of Britain's progress, often lying sealant or operating at reduced capacity. Trade slumped, wages plummeted, and unemployment soared. For the burgeoning working class crowded into the disease-ridden slums of Manchester, Birmingham, and London, life became a desperate daily struggle for survival. Imagine the scene. Families crammed into single rooms, sanitation virtually non-existent, the air thick with the stench of human waste and industrial smoke. Cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis weren't just diseases, they were constant companions, claiming lives with terrifying regularity, particularly among the young. The average life expectancy in some industrial towns was barely 20 years. And then there were the Corn Laws, a truly contentious issue that exacerbated the suffering. These protectionist tariffs, designed to keep the price of British-grown grain artificially high, were a boon for wealthy landowners but a disaster for the poor. When harvests were bad, as they frequently were in the early 1840s, the price of bread, the staple diet for millions, skyrocketed. We saw children with distended bellies, women weeping over empty larders, and men standing in endless queues for meagre relief. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the glittering balls and lavish banquets held in the West End, a brutal paradox of wealth and unimaginable squalor coexisting side by side. This widespread misery naturally fueled social unrest. The Chartist movement, which we touched upon earlier, gained immense traction during this period. They weren't asking for revolution, not yet, but for fundamental democratic reforms, universal male suffrage, secret ballots, annual parliaments, and the abolition of property qualifications for MPs. They believed that if the working man had a voice in Parliament, these injustices could be rectified. Millions signed their petitions, mass meetings were held across the country, and the spectre of popular uprising loomed large over the government. Simultaneously, the Anti-Corn Law League emerged, a powerful, well-organised movement primarily driven by the middle classes and industrialists. Led by figures like Richard Cobden and John Bright, they argued passionately for free trade, believing that cheaper food would benefit everyone, stimulate industry and alleviate poverty. Their arguments, both economic and moral, would eventually prove irresistible. As the decade wore on, Melbourne's government found itself increasingly unable to cope with these immense challenges. The bedchamber crisis had done little to endear Victoria to the Conservatives, but the political tide was turning irrevocably. In 1841, after years of economic hardship and political instability, the Whigs finally lost the general election. Sir Robert Peel, the man Victoria had spurned 2 years earlier, was now unequivocally Prime Minister. This shift brought a new dynamic to the palace. Victoria no longer had her beloved Melbourne, her political mentor and surrogate father. While she respected Peel's intellect and diligence, the warmth and easy camaraderie she shared with Melbourne were gone. She felt a certain loneliness, a void in her life, both personal and political, and it was into this space, this moment of transition, that a new pivotal figure was about to step, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. We had mentioned him briefly, but now it was time for him to truly enter the stage. Albert was Victoria's first cousin, and the idea of their marriage had been floated for years, primarily by their mutual uncle, King Leopold I of Belgium. Victoria had met Albert a few times before, initially finding him a little stiff, perhaps even a bit dull compared to her vivacious self. But when he visited again in 1839, something had changed. Albert was undeniably handsome, with a serious intellectual demeanour. He was cultured, well-educated, and possessed a deep sense of duty and moral rectitude. He was everything Victoria wasn't in some ways. Calm, reflective, and remarkably disciplined. She, on the other hand, was passionate, impulsive, and prone to strong attachments. We can only imagine the whirlwind of emotions that must have swept through her as she rediscovered him. She was, by her own account, utterly smitten. "He is extremely handsome," she wrote in her diary. "His eyes are large and blue, and he has a beautiful nose and a very sweet mouth with fine teeth." She was, in short, head over heels. Breaking with royal protocol, it was Victoria who proposed to Albert on October 15, 1839. A queen proposing to her chosen consort. It was another testament to her strong will, her refusal to be bound by convention when her heart was involved. Albert, though initially overwhelmed by the prospect of becoming consort to the most powerful woman in the world, accepted. He understood the immense responsibility, the loss of his own identity, and the challenges that lay ahead. Their engagement, announced in November, was met with mixed reactions. While the Queen's happiness was undeniable, the British public was initially wary of Albert. He was German, a foreigner, and many feared he would exert undue influence over the Queen. There were whispers of his family's relative poverty, and jokes were made about his perceived lack of worldliness. Parliament, ever frugal, even debated his annuity, granting him less than they had given previous consorts. It was hardly a warm welcome for the man who would become the bedrock of Victoria's life and reign. But for Victoria, Albert was everything. He was the intellectual companion, the moral compass, and the passionate lover she craved. Their marriage, set for February 1840, was not just a personal union. It was a political alliance emerging of two powerful personalities that would profoundly shape the Victorian age. As we prepare to witness their union, we must remember the backdrop, a nation in turmoil grappling with poverty, social unrest, and political upheaval. The young Queen and her German prince were about to embark on a journey that would redefine the monarchy and, indeed, the very fabric of British society. The stage was set for a new act in this grand, contradictory drama we call the Victorian Era. So there she was, our young Queen, Alexandrina Victoria, having done the unthinkable she proposed. And to her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, no less. You remember him, don't you? The rather stiff, intellectual German prince whom she initially found, well, a bit dull. But oh, how quickly those perceptions can change when intellect meets discipline and a shared vision begins to bloom. The stage was set. February 10th, 1840. A cold, grey London day perhaps, but within the walls of the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace, a different kind of warmth was kindling. We often picture royal weddings as grand, public spectacles, don't we? Think of the pomp and circumstance that would come to define later Victorian events. But this, our first royal wedding of the era, was a relatively subdued affair, intimate by today's standards. Yet the significance? Immeasurable. This wasn't just a marriage. It was the forging of a partnership that would profoundly shape the very identity of the age we're exploring. The public, as we mentioned, wasn't exactly throwing confetti in the streets. There was a palpable unease, a murmur of suspicion. A German prince? What influence would he wield over our young Queen? Would he be a puppet master, pulling the strings of the British monarchy from behind the throne? Parliament, ever watchful of the purse strings and national sentiment, had even haggled over his annuity, granting him a paltry £30,000 instead of the requested £50,000. A clear message, wouldn't you say, that he was expected to know his place? Imagine the scene. Victoria, radiant in white satin, a wreath of orange blossoms adorning her head, a choice that would, incidentally, set a bridal trend for generations. And Albert, handsome, yes, but perhaps a touch overwhelmed, stepping into a role that was, by all accounts, undefined and fraught with potential pitfalls. He was, after all, merely the Queen's consort, not king. He had no official constitutional position, no real power, and no established duties beyond supporting his wife. For a man of Albert's formidable intellect and drive, this was, to put it mildly, a challenging predicament. Here's where the paradox of early Victorian life truly begins to manifest within the royal household itself. On one hand, you have the burgeoning love story, a deeply personal and passionate connection between two young people. Victoria was utterly smitten, finding in Albert not just a husband, but an intellectual equal, a moral compass, and a rock against the turbulent seas of politics and public opinion. She adored him, hung on his every word, and quickly became dependent on his judgment. On the other hand, you have Albert's struggle. He arrived in England with a keen sense of purpose, a desire to be useful, to contribute. Yet he found himself isolated, viewed with suspicion by the British aristocracy, and even mocked by the press for his German accent and what some perceived as his stiffness or lack of typical British sporting interests. He was a foreigner in a land that was, at this point, deeply insular and often xenophobic. His meticulous nature, his love for order, his intellectual pursuits, all were initially met with a polite but unmistakable frostiness from the established court. It must have been incredibly frustrating for him, wouldn't you agree? To be so intelligent, so capable, yet so utterly without a formal outlet for his talents. But Albert was not one to be easily deterred. He was a man of quiet determination, a reformer at heart. He understood that true influence didn't always come from overt power, but from subtle, persistent effort. He began almost immediately to bring order to the notoriously chaotic royal household. The finances, the staffing, the daily routines, all came under his watchful eye. He introduced a German work ethic, an emphasis on efficiency and punctuality, which must have sent ripples of shock through the more relaxed, aristocratic court. We can almost hear the grumbling, can't we? Who is this young man changing our ways? Victoria, fiercely loyal, defended him at every turn. She saw his value, his vision, and his unwavering moral compass. And gradually, imperceptibly at first, Albert began to exert his influence. He became her private secretary, her confidant, and her most trusted advisor. He would read the state papers, discuss policy with her, and help her draft correspondence. While Lord Melbourne had been her political mentor, Albert became her intellectual and moral guide, shaping her perspective on everything from governance to personal conduct. And then the children started to arrive, rapidly. 9 of them over the next 17 years. The first Victoria Princess Royal was born just 9 months after the wedding in November 1840. Then came Albert Edward, the future Edward VII, affectionately known as Bertie, in November 1841. This flurry of births was not just a personal matter, it was a public declaration. It solidified the image of the royal couple as a fecund, stable unit, providing a clear line of succession and, crucially, presenting the monarchy as a family. This, dear reader, was a stroke of genius, though perhaps an unintentional one in its initial stages. In an era of profound social change, the Industrial Revolution tearing apart old communities and creating new, often brutal, urban landscapes, the rising middle class yearned for stability, for morality, for an ideal. And what did Victoria and Albert offer? The model royal family. They were depicted as a domestic unit, devoted to each other and their children, embodying the very virtues that the middle class held dear: hard work, piety, sobriety, and strong family values. Think about the sheer power of this image. While the hungry 40s continued to gnaw at the foundations of society, with disease-ridden slums in Manchester and Birmingham, and the clamour of the Chartist movement echoing through the streets, the monarchy was projecting an image of serene domesticity from Buckingham Palace and Windsor. It was a potent antidote to the chaos, a symbol of continuity and moral uprightness in a world that often felt like it was spinning out of control. Albert, ever the progressive, wasn't content with merely being a domestic icon. He threw himself into causes that he believed would benefit Britain and its people. He championed education, believing it was the key to progress. He became a patron of the arts and sciences, pushing for innovation and intellectual development. He was instrumental in establishing the Government School of Design, later the Royal College of Art, and played a crucial role in reforming the University of Cambridge. He saw the potential of industry, the power of scientific discovery, and the importance of public health. He even designed Balmoral Castle and Osborne House, creating royal residences that were, in their own way, reflections of his orderly, domestic, and aesthetically refined sensibilities. These homes weren't just palaces, they were family retreats, designed for comfort and privacy, a stark contrast to the more formal, public-facing residences of previous monarchs. So while he entered the scene as an outsider, a foreign prince viewed with suspicion, Albert quietly, meticulously, and with the unwavering support of his queen, began to transform the very fabric of the monarchy. He helped shift it from a more aristocratic, often scandalous institution to one that embodied middle-class virtues. He became the architect of what we now recognise as the modern British monarchy, a symbol of stability and moral rectitude that could resonate with a rapidly changing nation. It's a remarkable transformation, isn't it? From a young man with no defined role to the intellectual engine behind the throne, shaping not just the Queen, but the very image of the era itself. We see him, a quiet force, laying the groundwork for the great achievements that would define the mid-Victorian period. He was the counterpoint to the era's raw industrial power, the intellectual backbone to its moral aspirations. And as we move forward, we'll see how his vision, his relentless pursuit of progress, would culminate in one of the most iconic events of the entire Victorian age. But that, dear friends, is a story for our next chapter. For now, let us marvel at the quiet power of Prince Albert, the unexpected architect of an empire's image. Ah, Prince Albert, a man initially dismissed, even ridiculed as the foreign prince, a mere consort, a decorative appendage to the powerful young queen. But if you've been following our journey, you know by now that nothing in the Victorian era is ever quite what it seems on the surface, do you? Just as the glittering West End masked unimaginable squalor, so too did Albert's quiet demeanour conceal an intellect and a drive that would profoundly shape not just the monarchy, but the very trajectory of Britain and indeed the world. We left off with Albert diligently, almost invisibly, bringing order to the chaotic royal household, becoming Victoria's indispensable private secretary and confidant. But to imagine his ambitions stopped at balancing the royal ledgers or tutoring his wife on political theory would be to fundamentally misunderstand the man. Albert, you see, was a visionary. He believed in progress, not just as a concept but as a moral imperative. He saw the potential of science, industry and education to uplift humanity, to solve the very problems that plagued the nation during those grim, hungry 40s we've discussed. While Chartists marched for reform and the Anti-Corn Law League fought for cheaper bread, Albert was working behind the scenes, a quiet engine of change within the very heart of the establishment. He wasn't content to simply observe the world, he wanted to improve it. And he had the perfect partner in Victoria. Though she might have been the monarch, it was often Albert who provided the intellectual framework, the strategic thinking, and the relentless, almost obsessive pursuit of efficiency and excellence. He began subtly, championing causes that seemed tangential to royal duties but were, in fact, deeply significant. He became a patron of the arts and sciences, pushing for the reform of antiquated universities like Cambridge and Oxford, urging them to embrace modern scientific inquiry. He recognised that Britain's future lay not just in its factories but in the minds of its innovators, its engineers, its thinkers. He saw the need for practical education, for design, for applied science, concepts that were, at the time, still quite radical. And let us not forget the subtle yet profound influence he had on Victoria herself. Remember the impetuous, headstrong young queen who defied Parliament over her ladies of the bedchamber. Albert, with his calm demeanour and rigorous intellect, began to temper that raw passion with reasoned thought. He introduced her to new ideas, broadened her perspective beyond the confines of court and state papers. He taught her to think analytically, to consider the long-term implications of policy, to understand the social conditions of her people. She came to rely on his judgment implicitly, often referring to his notes and advice before making crucial decisions. Their relationship wasn't just a love story. It was a formidable intellectual partnership that lent a new gravitas to the crown. But even as the royal couple presented a picture of domestic bliss and growing intellectual engagement, the nation outside Kensington Palace walls was still reeling. The hungry 40s were a brutal reality for millions. Picture it, disease-ridden slums in Manchester and Birmingham teeming with factory workers whose lives were a relentless cycle of toil and poverty. The spectre of famine still loomed, particularly in Ireland, where the potato blight would soon unleash unimaginable devastation. Social unrest simmered, occasionally boiling over, as the working classes demanded a greater share of the burgeoning national wealth. The repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, a hard-won victory for the Anti-Corn Law League, offered some relief but did not magically erase the deep-seated inequalities. This was the backdrop against which Albert conceived of his grandest, most audacious project yet, the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of all Nations. Can you imagine the sheer audacity of such an idea in the mid-19th century? A global showcase, a celebration of human ingenuity, industry and peaceful international cooperation, all housed under one magnificent roof in the heart of London. It wasn't just a trade fair, it was a statement, a declaration that Britain, despite its internal struggles, stood at the vanguard of progress, ready to lead the world into a new era of industrial might and enlightened thought. The initial reaction, as you might expect, was far from enthusiastic. Many in Parliament scoffed at the idea, deeming it an expensive folly, a dangerous gathering of foreign radicals, or simply an impractical dream. The press was divided, some seeing it as a potential boon, others as a grand delusion. Even the public was sceptical. But Albert, with his characteristic quiet determination, refused to be deterred. He saw beyond the immediate obstacles, he envisioned a future. He formed a royal commission, tirelessly fundraising, organising and overseeing every minute detail. His vision was clear: to collect the finest examples of manufacturing, art and raw materials from across the globe, bringing them together for the world to witness. And the structure to house this marvel, it needed to be equally revolutionary. Enter Joseph Paxton, a gardener by trade, whose innovative design for a massive structure of glass and iron, inspired by the giant water lily, the Victoria Amazonica, captured Albert's imagination. This was the birth of the Crystal Palace, a temporary edifice that would become one of the most iconic symbols of the age. Think about it. A structure so vast, so light-filled, so utterly modern, unlike anything the world had ever seen. It stretched over 1,851 feet long, a subtle nod to the year perhaps, encompassing existing trees within its transparent walls. It was a marvel of prefabrication, erected with astonishing speed and efficiency, a testament to the very industrial prowess it was designed to celebrate. On May 1st, 1851, the Great Exhibition opened its doors, and what a day it was! Queen Victoria, Albert by her side, arrived in a procession of glittering carriages. The air buzzed with excitement, a symphony of anticipation. Inside the Crystal Palace, a sea of over 500,000 visitors, from the humblest labourers to the grandest aristocrats, thronged the immense nave. Imagine the sight, the sun streaming through the glass roof, illuminating thousands of exhibits from every corner of the British Empire and beyond. We're talking about everything from enormous steam engines and hydraulic presses, symbols of raw industrial power, to intricate lace and delicate porcelain, showcasing the pinnacle of craftsmanship. There were exotic goods from India and China, revolutionary farm machinery, scientific instruments, and even a giant lump of coal. It was a dizzying, overwhelming display of human achievement, a tangible manifestation of the era's boundless optimism and insatiable curiosity. For 6 months, the Crystal Palace captivated the world. Over 6 million people visited, a staggering figure for the time, equivalent to a third of Britain's entire population. They came by train, by omnibus, by foot, drawn by the spectacle, the novelty, the sheer wonder of it all. For many, it was their first glimpse of technology and culture from outside their immediate experience. It was an education, an entertainment, and a profound statement of national pride. The Great Exhibition was an unqualified triumph. Financially, it was a massive success, generating a surplus that would later be used to establish institutions like the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Science Museum, and the Natural History Museum, enduring legacies of Albert's vision for education and public enlightenment. Politically, it cemented Britain's position as the workshop of the world, a global superpower whose industrial might and imperial reach were unmatched. But beyond the statistics and the accolades, the exhibition marked a pivotal moment in the Victorian era. It was, in many ways, the culmination of the hungry 40s and the dawn of a new, more confident age. The anxieties of the early years, the fear of revolution, the widespread poverty, didn't vanish overnight, of course. We know better than to think history is that simple. But the Great Exhibition provided a powerful antidote, a unifying moment of national pride and optimism. It showcased what humanity, particularly British humanity, could achieve through innovation, hard work, and international cooperation. It shifted the national mood from one of apprehension to one of burgeoning confidence, an almost unshakable belief in progress. We were entering the mid-Victorian boom, a period of unprecedented economic growth and imperial expansion. The era of gas lamps and corsets, of rigid class structures and booming industry was now fully in its stride. Prince Albert, the quiet, determined foreign prince, had not only stabilised the monarchy but had also given the nation a mirror in which to see its own vast potential. He had, through sheer force of intellect and will, transformed the perception of Britain and, in doing so, laid the foundation for the next several decades of Victorian supremacy. But as we move forward, remember this. Even amidst the glittering triumph of the Crystal Palace, the paradoxes of the era continued to churn beneath the surface. For every marvel of engineering there was still a dark, unlit alley. For every celebration of progress, there was still a whisper of discontent. The Victorian era, ever the enigma shrouded in smog, was just getting started. And believe us, dear reader, it has so much more to reveal. The Crystal Palace, that shimmering behemoth of glass and iron, stood as a triumphant testament to British ingenuity. When the Great Exhibition of 1851 closed its doors, it didn't just mark the end of an event, it signalled the dawn of an entirely new phase for Victorian Britain, a period we often call the mid-Victorian boom. Imagine the collective exhale, the proud swell of chests across the nation, the apprehension of the hungry 40s, the spectre of Chartism, the fear of revolution echoing from the continent, all seemed to recede, replaced by a profound sense of confidence, a belief in progress that felt almost boundless. We often look back at these decades, roughly from the early 1850s to the mid-1870s, as the zenith of Victorian power and prosperity, and for good reason. This was an era where Britain truly was the workshop of the world, its factories churning out goods that supplied the globe, its merchant ships dominating the seas, and its capital fueling an ever-expanding empire. You could practically feel the economic engine roaring to life, powering railways across continents, spinning cotton in Manchester, and forging steel in Birmingham. What drove this incredible surge? Well, several factors converged beautifully, creating a perfect storm of prosperity. Firstly, Britain's industrial head start was undeniable. We had the coal, the iron, the skilled labour, and the entrepreneurial spirit to capitalise on new technologies. Secondly, the triumph of free trade, largely championed by figures like Richard Cobden, and solidified after the repeal of the Corn Laws, opened up new markets and lowered the cost of food, putting more disposable income into pocket, at least for some. Thirdly, the burgeoning empire provided both raw materials and captive markets, a symbiotic relationship that fueled further growth. This wasn't just about statistics, it was about a palpable shift in the national mood. The mid-Victorian period saw a dramatic expansion of the middle class, whose values became the bedrock of society. Respectability, self-help, hard work, thrift, and a strict moral code, these weren't just ideals, they were the very fabric of daily life for millions. You see it everywhere, in the growing number of suburban villas, each with its carefully manicured garden, in the proliferation of etiquette guides and self-improvement manuals, in the emphasis on domesticity and the angel in the house, that idealized woman whose domain was the home, a sanctuary from the harsh realities of the outside world. For the aspiring middle-class family, life was increasingly comfortable, even luxurious. Gas lamps lit their streets and homes, offering a brilliance unimaginable just a generation before. The railways made travel faster and more accessible, allowing for seaside holidays and visits to relatives. New consumer goods, from elaborate furniture to mass-produced clothing, filled their homes and wardrobes. And of course, there was the pursuit of education and culture, with libraries, museums, and lecture halls becoming increasingly popular. This was a society that believed in progress, not just economic, but moral and intellectual. They were building a better world, brick by respectable brick. But here, dear reader, is where we must pause and acknowledge the ever-present Victorian paradox. For every glittering West End promenade, there was a disease-ridden slum just a stone's throw away. For every middle-class family enjoying the fruits of prosperity, there were countless working-class families trapped in unimaginable squalor. The mid-Victorian boom was not a universal tide that lifted all boats equally, far from it. While some skilled labourers saw their wages rise and their conditions improve, the vast majority of the urban working class continued to face brutal realities. Overcrowding in cities reached epidemic proportions. Imagine entire families crammed into single rooms, sharing communal privies, with sanitation systems utterly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of people. The air itself was often thick with the stench of human waste, industrial smoke, and decaying refuse. It was in these conditions that the silent, invisible enemy of cholera continued its deadly march. Time and again, outbreaks would sweep through the poorer districts, indiscriminately claiming lives. It wasn't until the infamous Great Stink of 1858 that the seriousness of the problem finally forced action. The summer heat that year was so intense that the River Thames, clogged with centuries of sewage and industrial effluent, became an open sewer, emitting an unbearable stench that permeated Parliament itself. Imagine the scene: politicians literally fleeing their chambers, curtains soaked in disinfectant, all because the very air was unbreathable. It was a visceral, undeniable sign that the progress heralded by the Crystal Palace had a putrid underbelly. This crisis, however grotesque, proved to be a catalyst. It led directly to the monumental efforts of engineer Joseph Basil Jett, who designed and oversaw the construction of London's vast modern sewer system, a network of underground rivers that finally channeled waste away from the city, dramatically improving public health and hygiene. It's a powerful example of how the Victorians, when pushed, were capable of truly transformative public works, demonstrating their capacity for both enlightened progress and shocking neglect. Beyond the sewers, the mid-Victorian period also witnessed profound intellectual shifts. If the Industrial Revolution transformed the physical landscape, then Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, published in 1859, irrevocably reshaped the intellectual one. His theory of evolution by natural selection challenged centuries of religious dogma and profoundly altered humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. We can hardly overstate the impact of this book. It sparked furious debate, divided families, and forced a complete re-evaluation of faith, science, and morality. It was a seismic event, reminding us that even in an age of apparent stability, the very foundations of belief could be shaken. Amidst all this, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert continued to cultivate their image as the model royal family. They were the living embodiment of those middle-class virtues they so admired. With 9 children, their domestic life, though far grander than most, projected an image of stability, morality, and familial devotion. Albert, ever the visionary, continued his tireless work, promoting education, science, and the arts, often behind the scenes. He was the architect of royal efficiency, the intellectual engine of the monarchy, and Victoria's most trusted advisor. Their partnership, once viewed with suspicion, had blossomed into an indispensable alliance that provided a steady hand at the tiller during a period of immense change. Indeed, the empire itself was expanding at an astonishing rate during these decades. The sun, it was proudly declared, never set on British dominions. From India to Canada, Australia to vast swathes of Africa, the Union Jack fluttered over an ever-increasing portion of the globe. This imperial reach brought immense wealth and prestige, but also immense responsibility and often brutal conflict. The Indian Mutiny of 1857, a bloody and traumatic uprising against British rule, shattered any illusions of easy imperial dominance. It led to the dissolution of the East India Company and the direct rule of India by the British Crown, a significant shift that underscored both the power and the precariousness of the empire. It was a stark reminder that even at the height of their power, the Victorians faced challenges that tested their resolve and often their moral compass. So, as we survey the mid-Victorian boom, what do we see? A nation brimming with confidence, its industries thriving, its middle class flourishing, and its empire expanding. We see monumental achievements in engineering, groundbreaking scientific discoveries, and a royal family that had successfully redefined its role for a modern age. Yet we also see the persistent shadow of poverty, the lingering threat of disease and the profound social inequalities that simmered beneath the surface of respectability. It was a golden age, yes, but one gilded with the sweat of the working poor, and occasionally tarnished by the moral compromises of empire. It was a period of dazzling light and profound darkness, a symphony of innovation and a dirge of human suffering. And as the 1860s gave way to the Cenders, another, even deeper shadow was about to fall across the royal household, one that would irrevocably alter the course of Queen Victoria's reign, and in many ways the very character of the Victorian age itself. The stability that had seemed so unshakable was about to face its most personal and most profound challenge. The grand crescendo of the Great Exhibition, that magnificent symphony of innovation orchestrated by Prince Albert, had barely faded from the nation's ears when a discordant, chilling note began to sound. We had just celebrated Britain's undisputed triumph, a moment of unparalleled confidence. But as we hinted, a deeper shadow was about to fall across the royal household, one that would irrevocably alter Victoria's reign and the very character of the era. You see, for all his tireless energy and visionary intellect, Prince Albert was not a man of robust health. He was, in many ways, driven by an almost frantic sense of purpose, as if he knew his time was limited, and indeed it was. In the autumn of 1861, a profound illness began to grip him. Typhoid fever, we now believe, though the medical understanding of the time was, as with so much else, still in its infancy. For weeks he suffered, his condition deteriorating, while the public, largely unaware of the severity, went about their daily lives, still basking in the glow of the mid-Victorian boom. But within the walls of Windsor Castle, a different reality was unfolding. Queen Victoria, who had relied on Albert not just as a husband and father to their 9 children, but as her intellectual compass, her political advisor, her soulmate, watched in agony. She had loved him with a ferocity that few monarchs, or indeed few people, ever experience. He was her angel, her dearest Albert, the man who had brought order to her life and purpose to her reign. To see him fading, to feel the encroaching void, was to witness the foundations of her entire world begin to crumble. On December 14th, 1861, just a few weeks shy of his 43rd birthday, Prince Albert, the man who had done so much to shape the modern monarchy and the very identity of Victorian Britain, breathed his last. Imagine, if you will, the sudden devastating silence that must have fallen over Windsor. The man who had been the engine of progress, the moral compass, the intellectual architect of so much that defined the age, was gone, just like that. His passing was not merely a personal tragedy for the Queen, it was a national catastrophe. For 21 years he had been the steady, often unseen, hand guiding the monarchy, modernising the royal household, championing science, education and social reform. He had been the perfect foil to Victoria's passionate, sometimes impulsive nature. Now he was gone, leaving a vacuum so immense it threatened to swallow everything in its path. Victoria's grief was immediate, overwhelming and absolute. Her world, so carefully constructed, so perfectly balanced, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She retreated into a mourning so profound, so all-encompassing, that it defined the rest of her life, and, in many ways, the popular image of the Victorian era itself. From that day forward she would wear black, a perpetual widow, a living monument to her lost love. Her residences were kept as shrines to Albert, his clothes laid out daily, his rooms preserved exactly as he left them. She would sleep with his nightshirt by her side, a desperate attempt to cling to the ghost of his presence. This was not merely a private sorrow, it was a public declaration. The widow of Windsor was born, and with her birth came a profound shift in the monarchy's relationship with its people. Albert had been the bridge between the crown and the burgeoning middle class, embodying their virtues of hard work, domesticity, and moral rectitude. His death and Victoria's subsequent withdrawal created a chasm. For years the Queen became a recluse. She refused to open Parliament in person, avoided public appearances, and largely delegated her duties to her children and ministers. Her court, once vibrant and bustling, became a sombre affair. While the nation thrummed with industrial might and imperial ambition, its very heart, its sovereign, retreated into a silence so profound it threatened to swallow the monarchy whole. This period, often referred to as Victoria's years of silence or the Queen's seclusion, was a crucial turning point. On the one hand, her deep, unwavering devotion to Albert, her profound and public grief, resonated deeply with a society that valued sentiment and domesticity. It cemented her image as a devoted wife and mother, a poignant symbol of enduring love. But on the other hand, her prolonged absence from public life began to erode public goodwill. Think about it. Here was a nation at the zenith of its power, grappling with unprecedented social change, scientific discoveries that challenged millennia of belief, and an empire expanding at an astonishing rate. And its queen, its figurehead, was nowhere to be seen. Where was the monarch to inspire confidence, to represent the nation on the world stage, to perform the ceremonial duties that lent gravity and legitimacy to the government? We often marvel at the paradoxes of the Victorian era, don't we? Here's another one for you. An age defined by its relentless march forward, by innovation and outward expansion, was now led by a monarch steeped in perpetual mourning, looking resolutely backward to a lost love. While engineers were building bridges, laying railways, and designing sanitation systems to combat the very diseases that took Albert, the Queen remained cloistered, her world frozen in time. This led to a burgeoning Republican sentiment. Pamphlets questioning the utility and expense of the monarchy began to circulate. Radical politicians openly wondered if Britain wouldn't be better off without a monarch who seemed to have abandoned her duties. Where was the Queen, people are grumbled. Where was the mother of the nation when the nation needed her? Even her own ministers struggled to govern effectively without the Queen's active participation. Indeed, the decade following Albert's death was marked by a deep sense of unease, both within the royal family and across the nation. Victoria's children, particularly the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, chafed under her strictures and her constant idealisation of their fear, whom she often contrasted unfavourably with them. The Queen's grief was so absolute that it cast a long shadow over their lives too, demanding a level of deference to Albert's memory that felt oppressive. Yet even in her seclusion, Victoria remained Queen. Her image, though often seen in sombre widow's weeds, still carried immense weight. The British Empire continued to expand, industrial output soared, and social reforms, many of which Albert himself had championed, continued to be enacted. The Great Stink of London, for example, which we mentioned earlier, finally spurred Joseph Bazalgette's monumental sewer system into existence in the years immediately following Albert's death, a testament to the era's unwavering commitment to progress, even in the absence of a visible monarch. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, published just 2 years before Albert's death, continued to send shockwaves through society, forcing a re-evaluation of humanity's place in the natural world, regardless of who sat on the throne. The political landscape too continued its relentless evolution. This period of Victoria's withdrawal set the stage for the rise of 2 titanic figures who would define much of the latter half of her reign: Benjamin Disraeli and William Gladstone. These men, with their contrasting ideologies and personalities, would eventually, through sheer political will and strategic charm, begin the slow, arduous process of drawing the Widow of Windsor back into public life, albeit a changed woman forever marked by her profound loss. Albert's death was not just the end of an individual life, it was the end of an era within an era. The mid-Victorian boom, while continuing economically, lost its guiding light, its intellectual North Star. The world moved on, but Victoria for a long time did not, and in that poignant stasis, in that profound grief, we find yet another layer of the Victorian enigma, an age of relentless forward momentum led by a queen who for a time simply could not move on. It was a testament to the strength of the institution, perhaps, that it could withstand such a prolonged period of royal absence. Or perhaps it was a testament to the sheer momentum of the age itself, an unstoppable force that continued to shape the world, even when its most prominent figure chose to retreat from it. We left Queen Victoria shrouded in a grief so profound, so absolute, it threatened to eclipse the very light of the British Empire. Prince Albert, her anchor, her intellectual equal, her beloved angel, was gone. The year was 1861, and for the woman who had embodied stability and progress, time seemed to stop. She retreated, you see, into a world of black crape and an almost sacred devotion to Albert's memory. The Widow of Windsor was not just a title, it was a state of being, a public declaration of personal sorrow that would define the next 2 decades of her reign. But here's the thing about history, isn't it? It doesn't pause for personal tragedy, no matter how monumental. While Victoria mourned, refusing to open Parliament, shunning public appearances, and largely delegating her duties to a shrinking circle of trusted aides, the nation she ruled continued its relentless march forward. Britain, the workshop of the world, was still spinning its industrial gears, still expanding its empire, still grappling with the social complexities forged in the crucible of innovation. The very paradox of the Victorian age intensified. A vibrant, dynamic society powering ahead, led by an almost ghost-like monarch, present only in name. This prolonged royal withdrawal, as you can imagine, created a gaping chasm between the crown and its people. The carefully cultivated image of the model royal family, so vital to the monarchy's revival, began to fray at the edges. What good was a queen who refused to be seen? What was the purpose of a monarchy that felt more like an expensive relic than a living symbol? Republican sentiment, which had been simmering quietly, now began to bubble to the surface with increasing urgency. Pamphlets questioned the cost of the monarchy, cartoons depicted a perpetually veiled figure, and public discourse openly debated the crown's relevance in an increasingly democratic and meritocratic age. We saw a stark question emerge. Could a modern nation truly thrive with an absent head, or was it time for a new chapter entirely? Into this fascinating, tumultuous vacuum stepped 2 titans of British politics, men whose rivalry would define the latter half of the Victorian era, Benjamin Disraeli and William Gladstone. If you truly want to understand this period, you must understand these 2 figures, for they were not merely politicians, they were embodiments of conflicting philosophies, clashing personalities, and utterly distinct visions for Britain. Let's meet them, shall we? First, there was William Gladstone. Ah, Gladstone. The very name conjures images of earnestness, moral rectitude, and an almost overwhelming sense of duty. He was the quintessential liberal, a man of deep Christian faith and intellectual rigour, renowned for his prodigious work ethic and his lengthy, often dense parliamentary speeches. He was the grand old man, the GOM to his admirers, a statesman who believed in reform, in fiscal prudence, and in the moral uplift of the individual. He was a champion of free trade, a fervent advocate for extending the franchise, and a tireless reformer who sought to bring efficiency and integrity to government. His approach to politics was one of high principle and meticulous detail, often delving deep into the intricacies of budgets and legislation. He was, in short, everything that Prince Albert might have admired: intelligent, diligent, and morally upright. Then there was Benjamin Disraeli. What a contrast! If Gladstone was the austere moralist, Disraeli was the flamboyant showman, the enigmatic novelist turned statesman, a man of wit, charm, and audacious ambition. A conservative, yes, but of a unique, almost paradoxical stripe. He was an outsider, a Jew by birth in a deeply Anglican society, who had charmed his way to the top of the Tory party. Disraeli understood the power of spectacle, the importance of empire, and the need to appeal to the imagination of the people. He was the wily old fox, a master of political manoeuvring, a man who saw the grand sweep of history and Britain's place within it. Where Gladstone saw the moral imperatives, Disraeli saw national destiny. Where Gladstone saw economy, Disraeli saw glory. His policies, often surprisingly progressive for a conservative, aimed to elevate the condition of the people while simultaneously bolstering the prestige of the crown and the empire. These two men, so utterly different, found themselves locked in a political dance that would captivate the nation for decades, a rivalry so intense it became known as the Great Political Duel. And central to their respective strategies was the enigmatic figure of the grieving Queen Victoria. How then did they approach the monarch who refused to govern? Gladstone, with his earnest, almost professorial demeanour, often struggled to connect with Victoria. He was all facts, figures, and moral arguments, qualities she had admired in Albert but found overwhelming in others, especially when delivered with Gladstone's characteristic lengthy explanations. She often found his letters tedious, his presence draining, and his moralising tiresome. He would present her with meticulously detailed policy proposals, expecting her to engage with them intellectually much as Albert would have. But Victoria in her grief sought comfort, not challenge. She wanted reassurance, not lectures. Gladstone, in his principled honesty, was simply not equipped to provide the kind of emotional balm she craved. He saw his role as serving the nation through sound governance. He expected the Queen to understand and endorse that. This often led to friction, with Victoria feeling lectured and Gladstone feeling unappreciated. Disraeli, however, was a different breed entirely. He understood the Queen's psychology with an almost uncanny intuition. He knew she craved flattery, not just empty words, but sincere admiration for her position and her devotion to Albert's memory. He understood the power of ceremony and tradition, and he recognised that Victoria, despite her reclusiveness, still possessed an innate sense of her own regal authority. Disraeli didn't bombard her with dense policy papers. He charmed her with witty anecdotes, gossipy letters about court life, and grand visions of empire that resonated with her sense of national pride. He treated her not just as a monarch, but as a woman who had suffered an immense personal loss, offering sympathy and understanding rather than political demands. He was a master of the theatrical gesture, and it paid dividends. Disraeli famously declared, "The Queen is a woman, and a very clever woman, but she is a woman." He didn't try to change her, he adapted himself to her. He would write her letters that were less about government business and more about soothing her sorrow, praising her wisdom, and subtly reminding her of her indispensable role. He understood that she valued her role as Empress more than her duties as Queen of Great Britain, and he played to that, famously bestowing upon her the title Empress of India in 1876. This was not just a political move, it was a deeply personal one, a grand gesture that appealed directly to Victoria's romanticised view of her own destiny and Albert's legacy. Under Disraeli's subtle persuasion, Victoria began ever so slowly to emerge from her deepest seclusion. It wasn't a full return to public life, not by a long shot. She still preferred to conduct much of her business from Windsor or Balmoral, but she did begin to engage more, to appear at carefully chosen public events, to perform some of the ceremonial duties expected of her. Disraeli, with his genius for public relations, managed to bridge the gap between the reclusive monarch and a public increasingly impatient for a visible head of state. He made her feel valued, respected, and crucially understood. Meanwhile, the nation itself was undergoing further seismic shifts. The mid-Victorian boom continued, fueling unprecedented industrial growth and imperial expansion. Britain was truly at its zenith, a global superpower whose flag flew over a quarter of the world's landmass. Yet the same paradoxes we've explored persisted. Glittering wealth in the West End still coexisted with unimaginable squalor in the East End. The glorious expansion of empire often built on the exploitation of distant lands and peoples. The political landscape, too, was constantly evolving. Both Gladstone and Disraeli, despite their ideological differences, were instrumental in extending the democratic franchise. Disraeli surprisingly passed the Second Reform Act in 1807, almost doubling the electorate by giving the vote to many urban working men. This was a bold, almost audacious move for a Conservative, a testament to his belief in Tory democracy and his keen understanding of the shifting sands of public opinion. Gladstone, in turn, continued his relentless programme of reforms, tackling everything from army administration to elementary education, striving to create a more meritocratic and efficient state. The intellectual currents of the age were also in full flow. Darwin's On the Origin of Species continued to provoke fierce debate, challenging established religious beliefs and forcing a re-evaluation of humanity's place in the natural world. New scientific discoveries, technological innovations, and medical advancements were constantly reshaping daily life, from the ongoing development of the railway network to the burgeoning use of electricity. The world was shrinking, connected by telegraph cables and steamships, bringing both opportunities and anxieties. But amidst all this progress and political manoeuvring, the ghost of Albert still lingered, a constant, powerful presence in Victoria's life and, by extension, in the life of the monarchy. Her children, particularly the Prince of Wales, felt the weight of their father's absence and their mother's unwavering devotion to his memory. Bertie, as he was known, chafed under Victoria's critical eye, forever compared to his perfect departed father. His own attempts to carve out a public role were often met with disapproval, further highlighting the chasm between the Queen's grief and the needs of a modernising monarchy. So, as the 1870s gave way to the 1880s, we found Britain in a fascinating state of flux. The political stage was dominated by the epic battles between Gladstone and Disraeli, each striving to shape the nation in their own image. The empire continued its inexorable expansion, a source of immense pride and complex moral questions. And at the heart of it all, yet often seemingly removed, was the figure of Queen Victoria, slowly, reluctantly being coaxed back into the public eye, her personal tragedy having irrevocably altered her reign and the very character of the Victorian era. The question wasn't just if the monarchy would survive, but what kind of monarchy it would become, forged in the crucible of grief and an ever-accelerating modern world. The stage was set, not just for political drama, but for a profound redefinition of what it meant to be queen. Prince Albert's death in 1861 wasn't just a personal tragedy for Queen Victoria, it was in many ways a national calamity, a sudden, brutal amputation of the monarchy's very public heart. We've seen how Albert, with his quiet brilliance, had not only modernised the royal household, but had also, alongside Victoria, crafted an image of the model royal family, a beacon of middle-class virtue that resonated deeply with a rapidly changing society. Now, that beacon was extinguished. Victoria's grief was immediate, overwhelming and absolute. She retreated so completely from public life that she earned the enduring melancholic moniker, the Widow of Windsor. For the rest of her long reign, a staggering 40 years, she would wear black, a perpetual symbol of her loss, a walking monument to her beloved Albert. Her homes became shrines, his rooms preserved exactly as he left them, his clothes laid out daily. This wasn't just personal sorrow, it was a profound, almost pathological withdrawal that reshaped the very fabric of the British monarchy. Think about it. The monarch, the symbolic head of the nation, vanished behind palace walls, refusing to attend state openings of Parliament, avoiding public appearances, cancelling royal engagements. What message did this send to a nation still grappling with the complexities of industrialisation, imperial expansion, and social reform? It created a chasm, a vacuum at the heart of the state. Suddenly, the very relevance of the crown was called into question. Republican sentiment, once a fringe idea, began to gain traction. Pamphlets were circulated, speeches were made asking, quite reasonably, what purpose a monarch served if they refused to be seen, to engage, to lead. We, as a society, demand our leaders to be visible, don't we? To be present in our triumphs and our struggles. Victoria's prolonged seclusion seemed to many a dereliction of that very public duty. Yet even in her absence, the nation continued its relentless, often brutal march forward, and into the void left by the grieving Queen stepped two political titans, two figures whose rivalry would define British politics for decades, shaping both its domestic landscape and its imperial ambitions, William Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli. Imagine the clash of these personalities. On one side we had William Gladstone, the earnest, deeply principled liberal. He was a man of formidable intellect, a prodigious orator, and a devout high church Anglican, whose political career was often fueled by a profound sense of moral righteousness. He believed deeply in fiscal prudence, free trade, and gradual social reform. He championed the working man, sought to alleviate poverty, and believed in the moral imperative of good governance. His policies were often complex, deeply considered, and aimed at rationalising the state, from civil service reform to the disestablishment of the Irish Church. He was in many ways the embodiment of Victorian earnestness and intellectual rigour. But oh, how Victoria struggled with him. She found him preachy, his long detailed explanations tedious, his moralising tiresome. His liberal reforms, often aimed at dismantling old privileges and expanding democratic participation, felt to her like an assault on the very tradition she held dear. He was, for all his brilliance, a man of the people, and she, the grieving Queen, increasingly felt alienated from the democratic currents he represented. Their relationship was often strained, marked by mutual respect but little warmth. Then on the other side stood Benjamin Disraeli, the flamboyant, charismatic conservative. What a contrast! A Jewish-born dandy turned Tory leader, a novelist and social climber who had charmed his way to the top of the aristocratic party. Disraeli was a master of wit, an astute political strategist, and a man who understood the power of spectacle and myth. Where Gladstone was all substance and solemnity, Disraeli was style and showmanship. He spoke of one nation conservatism, appealing to both the working classes and the aristocracy, though his policies often seemed to prioritise imperial grandeur and national prestige. Disraeli, unlike Gladstone, understood Victoria. He understood her grief, her need for flattery, her immense pride in the empire that was now truly her own. He didn't lecture, he charmed. He didn't bore her with details, he painted grand visions. Famously, he bestowed upon her the title Empress of India in 18 Sinwooks, a stroke of genius that appealed directly to her sense of imperial destiny and helped to coax her, however grudgingly, back into a more public role. He made her feel important, revered, even in her mourning. He knew how to play to her emotions, and she in turn developed a genuine fondness for her Dizzy. Their rivalry, often dubbed the Grand Old Man versus the Jew, was legendary. It wasn't just a clash of parties. It was a clash of ideologies, of personalities, of visions for Britain. Their parliamentary debates were gladiatorial contests, their political campaigns epic struggles for the heart and mind of the nation. Gladstone, with his moral crusade, saw Disraeli as an unprincipled opportunist. Disraeli, with his cynical wit, saw Gladstone as a self-righteous bore, and through it all they shaped a modern two-party system, defining the very terms of political engagement in Britain. But what of the heir? The future king, Prince Albert Edward, known to us and to his family as Bertie. Ah, Bertie. His story during this period is one of immense pressure and profound disappointment. Imagine growing up in the shadow of a father like Prince Albert, a man of intellect, industry, and impeccable moral rectitude, a man who in his mother's eyes could do no wrong. Now imagine that father dying tragically young, leaving behind a mother who idolised him and projected all her hopes and criticisms onto you. Albert had always been disappointed by Bertie. He found his eldest son frivolous, more interested in horse racing and society than in serious study or public duty. He had attempted, with characteristic rigour, to mould Bertie into a carbon copy of himself, subjecting him to a gruelling educational regimen designed to produce a philosopher king. It failed spectacularly. Bertie simply wasn't built that way. He was genial, charming, sociable, but lacked his father's intellectual drive and moral earnestness. After Albert's death, Victoria's criticism of Bertie intensified to an almost unbearable degree. She blamed him, in part, for his father's death, believing Albert had succumbed to typhoid after catching a chill, while reprimanding Bertie for a minor scandal. She constantly compared him unfavourably to the idealised image of Albert. She refused to give him meaningful responsibilities, fearing he would squander them, fearing he would tarnish the royal image. He was kept on a tight leash, denied access to state papers, treated like an eternal schoolboy. How did Bertie respond to this relentless pressure, this constant disappointment? He rebelled in his own way. Denied a serious role, he embraced a life of pleasure and social engagement. He became a leading figure in London society, setting trends in fashion, cuisine, and entertainment. He cultivated a wide circle of friends, often drawn from the aristocracy and the international elite, people who appreciated his charm and wit, rather than judging him against an impossible standard. His fast lifestyle, his love of gambling, his affairs, his general bonhomie often scandalised his mother and the more conservative elements of Victorian society. He was the antithesis of the model royal family image Albert had so carefully constructed. Yet here lies another delicious Victorian paradox, doesn't it? While Victoria retreated into her grief, becoming increasingly remote and symbolic, Bertie, for all his perceived flaws, inadvertently kept the monarchy visible, relevant, and even fashionable. He was seen, he was talked about, he was there in his own way, a public figure, however controversial. He engaged with the people, albeit often in the ballrooms and racetracks of the upper echelons, rather than in the solemn halls of Parliament. He was building his own identity, his own version of royal duty, even if it wasn't the one his mother or his father would have chosen for him. So, as the 1860s bled into the 1870s, Britain found itself in a curious state. A grieving queen hidden from view, two political giants battling for supremacy, and a Prince of Wales struggling to escape the shadow of his idealised father, forging his own path through a society that was rapidly redefining itself. The tensions were palpable, the changes relentless, and the future of the monarchy, and indeed the nation, remained a grand, unfolding drama, full of unexpected twists and turns. The stage was set for even greater transformations, for new challenges to old ideas, and for the continued, often tumultuous, expansion of an empire that seemed at times to defy gravity itself. So we left you, dear readers, with the nation caught in a fascinating, often frustrating tug of war. On one side, the earnest, morally driven liberal William Gladstone, forever seeking to uplift the common man and reform the machinery of state. On the other, the dazzling, enigmatic conservative Benjamin Disraeli, a man of grand imperial visions and a talent for charming the very monarch Gladstone found so difficult. This political drama, playing out against the backdrop of a grieving queen and a pleasure-seeking heir, defined much of the 1870s and beyond, shaping Britain's destiny in ways both profound and paradoxical. You see, while Victoria retreated into the sombre solitude of widowhood, and Bertie danced his way through the social seasons, the real power struggle for the soul of Britain was often waged in Parliament, in the press, and increasingly across the globe. Disraeli, with his flair for the dramatic, understood the power of spectacle and the allure of empire. It was he, remember, who crowned Victoria Empress of India in 1806, a move that not only flattered the Queen, but also solidified Britain's claims over its most prized colonial possession. This wasn't merely a title, it was a statement, a declaration that Britain's reach was not just vast, but imperial, an empire upon which, as the saying went, the sun never set. And what an empire it was becoming. The mid-Victorian boom had propelled Britain to unprecedented economic heights, and with that wealth came an insatiable appetite for resources, markets, and strategic outposts. This era, particularly from the 1880s onward, witnessed what we now call the scramble for Africa. Suddenly the vast, mysterious continent was carved up by European powers with the precision of a butcher's knife, each nation vying for a slice. Britain, of course, wanted the biggest and best cuts. Think of it, from the fertile Nile Valley to the diamond-rich lands of southern Africa. British explorers, missionaries and soldiers planted the Union Jack with fervent zeal. Was it a noble endeavour, a civilizing mission, to bring progress and Christianity to what was often perceived as a dark continent? Or was it a brutal exercise in exploitation, driven by greed and a chilling sense of racial superiority? The Victorians, in their characteristic way, managed to believe both simultaneously. They built railways, yes, and suppressed local conflicts, but they also extracted immense wealth, imposed their culture, and often did so with a callous disregard for indigenous peoples and their ancient ways of life. We look back now, and the contradictions are stark, almost breathtaking. They preached morality at home, yet practiced ruthless expansion abroad. This imperial expansion wasn't without its costs, of course. Wars, often bloody and protracted, became a regular feature of the news from distant lands. The Zulu Wars, the Anglo-Afghan Wars, the campaigns in Egypt and Sudan, these were not just faraway skirmishes, they were deeply felt at home, bringing both national pride and occasionally waves of moral outrage and grief. You can almost picture the Victorian families gathered around the morning paper, reading dispatches from the front, their sons and brothers fighting for Queen and Empire in lands they could barely imagine. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the landscape continued its relentless transformation. The great industrial cities, once symbols of progress, were now grappling with the full weight of their own success. The population explosion continued unabated, pushing urban centres to their breaking point. London, a sprawling behemoth, was a city of stark contrasts. The glittering West End, where the wealthy paraded in their finery, and the unimaginable squalor of the East End, where poverty, disease and crime festered. Charles Booth's monumental life and labour of the people in London, begun in the 1880s, painted a shocking statistical picture, revealing that nearly a third of Londoners lived in abject poverty. It was a stark wake-up call, shattering any lingering illusions of universal prosperity. These revelations, combined with the tireless work of social reformers and journalists, began to chip away at the rigid Victorian mindset. The belief that poverty was solely the result of individual moral failing started to yield to a more nuanced understanding of systemic issues. Philanthropy, a cornerstone of Victorian charity, continued. But there was also a growing clamour for state intervention. We see the seeds of the modern welfare state being sown here, with discussions around public health, housing and education gaining traction. The Fabian Society, founded in 1884, began advocating for gradual socialist reforms, pushing against the laissez-faire orthodoxy that had dominated much of the century. And what of the intellectual landscape? Darwin's On the Origin of Species had already shaken the foundations of religious belief, and the reverberations continued to echo. New scientific discoveries, from advancements in physics to the burgeoning field of psychology, challenged traditional certainties. The very notion of truth, once so absolute, seemed to fragment into a myriad of perspectives. Art and literature too reflected this shifting ground. The aesthetic movement, with its art for art's sake philosophy, openly defied the utilitarian and moralistic dictates of mainstream Victorian culture. Oscar Wilde, with his wit and scandalous lifestyle, became a symbol of this emerging counterculture, pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable and often paying a heavy price for it. It was a time of questioning, of doubt, even as the empire reached its zenith. There was a sense, a subtle undercurrent, that the grand certainties of the mid-Victorian era were starting to fray at the edges. The world was becoming more complex, more interconnected, and less easily defined by simple moral binaries. Throughout all this, Queen Victoria, the widow of Windsor, remained a powerful, albeit often unseen presence. Her public appearances were still rare, but when she did emerge, she was met with immense reverence. The image of the stoic, black-clad monarch, the grandmother of Europe, became deeply ingrained in the national consciousness. She embodied stability, tradition, and the vastness of the empire. Her personal grief had, paradoxically, transformed her into a symbol of collective endurance. Yet the chasm between the Queen and her heir, Bertie, remained. His mother's disapproval was a constant shadow, pushing him further into a life of social engagements, gambling, and affairs. He was, by all accounts, a man who loved life, good food, beautiful women, and the company of witty conversationalists. He cultivated a vibrant social circle, often including figures from the arts and theatre, which further scandalised his mother and the more conservative elements of society. But here's the fascinating twist. Bertie, through his very un-Victorian behaviour, inadvertently kept the monarchy visible and relevant in a way his reclusive mother could not. He attended races, opened public parks, hosted lavish dinners, and travelled extensively, acting as an unofficial ambassador for Britain. He was a familiar face, a living link between the distant revered monarch and the burgeoning modern world. He embodied a different kind of royalty, one that was more accessible, more human, perhaps even more flawed, but undeniably there. While Victoria reigned from the shadows of him, Bertie shone, albeit controversially, in the glare of public life, keeping the flame of royal visibility alight. So, as the century marched towards its close, Britain found itself at a crossroads. An empire of unprecedented scale and power, yet grappling with profound social inequalities at home, a nation embracing new scientific and intellectual frontiers, even as it clung to traditional moral codes, and at its head, a queen who represented the very essence of Victorian stability, yet whose air was already signalling a departure from her rigid ideals. The stage was set, you see, for the grand finale of an era that even in its twilight continued to surprise, confound, and define the very essence of modernity. The approaching fin de siècle was not just the end of a century, it was the uneasy dawn of a new world. As the 19th century began its slow, inevitable slide towards the 20th, a strange new mood descended upon Britain. It was the fin de siècle, a feeling of both exhaustion and exhilaration, of grand achievement and gnawing doubt. We had seen the empire stretch to its furthest reaches, a vast crimson swathe across the globe, yet beneath the surface anxieties simmered. Was this truly the zenith? Or were we witnessing the first cracks in the edifice? You see, the scramble for Africa, that frantic, often brutal dash for colonial possessions we touched upon, was anything but a clean, glorious affair. It was a messy, morally ambiguous enterprise, and nowhere was this more starkly illustrated than in the whole Second Boer War, 1899 to 1902. Here in the sun-baked velds of southern Africa, the seemingly invincible British Lion met its match in two small independent Boer republics, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. These were descendants of Dutch settlers, fiercely independent farmers, and they weren't about to give up their land and their gold mines without a fight. What began as a swift imperial chastisement quickly devolved into a prolonged, costly and deeply unpopular conflict. The Boers, masters of guerrilla warfare, harried the massive British forces, inflicting humiliating defeats. And how did Britain respond? With scorched earth tactics, burning farms, and, infamously, the establishment of concentration camps for Boer women and children. Over 20,000 women and children perished in these camps from disease and starvation. We, the proud standard-bearers of civilization, were suddenly facing international condemnation and a crisis of conscience at home. The jingoistic fervour of earlier decades began to curdle into a bitter taste in the mouth. Was this the true face of empire? Was this the cost of global dominance? It forced us to look inward, to question the very morality of our imperial project. Meanwhile, back on the home front, those stark social inequalities Charles Booth had so meticulously documented were not fading away. In fact, the very prosperity that fueled the empire often seemed to bypass the working classes, or at least failed to provide them with basic dignity and security. The clamour for social justice grew louder, more organised. We saw the rise of powerful trade unions, no longer just local guilds but national forces, demanding better wages, safer conditions, and the right to collective bargaining. They were challenging the long-held Victorian belief in laissez-faire economics, arguing that the state had a responsibility to protect its citizens from the excesses of industrial capitalism. This era also witnessed the quiet intellectual birth of socialism in Britain, not as a revolutionary cry but as a reasoned argument for gradual reform. The Fabian Society, founded in 1884, counted among its members intellectual heavyweights like George Bernard Shaw and Sidney and Beatrice Webb. They advocated for incremental change, for the permeation of socialist ideas into existing political parties and institutions, rather than violent overthrow. Their message, that the state could and should intervene to create a more equitable society. It was a radical idea for a nation so deeply wedded to individual liberty and minimal government, yet it laid the groundwork for the welfare state that would emerge in the next century. And what about the other half of humanity, the women of Britain? They too were finding their voices, though their struggle for the vote would truly explode into the public consciousness in the Edwardian era. Yet the seeds were firmly planted in these late Victorian years. Women were increasingly educated, entering professions and challenging the rigid domestic sphere that had defined their lives. They campaigned for property rights, for access to higher education, and for a say in the laws that governed them. The Victorian era, for all its patriarchal structures, was also the crucible where modern feminism began to forge its arguments. But it wasn't just social structures that were shifting. The very fabric of daily life was undergoing a silent, yet profound revolution. Imagine a world without the internal combustion engine, without moving pictures, without widespread electricity. Now, imagine those things arriving. Suddenly, the horseless carriage clattered down the street, a noisy harbinger of personal freedom and rapid transit. The flickering images of early cinema captivated audiences, offering a new form of mass entertainment and escapism. Electric lights began to push back the gaslit gloom of cities, and the telephone connected voices across vast distances. These were not mere gadgets, they were harbingers of modernity, fundamentally altering how people lived, worked, and communicated. Culturally, the rigid Victorian moral code, so long the bedrock of society, began to show cracks. The aesthetic movement, with its motto "art for art's sake," openly challenged Victorian utilitarianism and moralizing. Figures like Oscar Wilde, with his flamboyant wit and scandalous lifestyle, became the epitome of this cultural rebellion. His plays, sparkling with epigrams, satirized the very hypocrisy that underpinned much of Victorian society. His eventual downfall, a public trial and imprisonment for gross indecency, was a stark reminder of the era's lingering conservatism, yet it also highlighted the growing tension between personal liberty and societal control. The world was clearly moving on, even if some refused to acknowledge it. Amidst all this ferment, one figure remained a constant, an immovable anchor in a sea of change: Queen Victoria. She had reigned for so long that for most Britons she was simply the Queen, the only monarch they'd ever known. Her mourning for Albert had never truly lifted, but by the 1890s, the widow of Windsor had been subtly coaxed back into a more visible role, largely thanks to Disraeli's flattery and the sheer weight of her longevity. In 1897, the nation celebrated her Diamond Jubilee, marking 60 years on the throne. It was an astonishing spectacle, a grand imperial pageant that dwarfed even her Golden Jubilee a decade earlier. Troops from every corner of the empire, from Canada to India, Australia to Africa, marched through the streets of London, a dazzling display of military might and colonial diversity. Victoria, now a frail white-haired old woman, rode in her carriage a small black-clad figure at the heart of the procession. The cheers were deafening, the adoration palpable. It was a moment of national pride, a reaffirmation of Britain's place in the world, and a final magnificent flourish for the ageing monarch. For a brief, shining moment, the doubts about empire, the social unrest, the cultural anxieties, all seemed to fade away, replaced by a collective sense of achievement and stability. But even the most enduring reigns must come to an end. On January 2nd, 1901, at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, Queen Victoria breathed her last. She was 81 years old and had reigned for an incredible 73 years and 7 months, the longest-serving monarch in British history until Queen Elizabeth II. Her death sent a profound shockwave through the nation and the world. For an entire generation, perhaps two, she had been Britain. Her image was on every coin, her name on countless institutions, her presence a silent, steady hand guiding a rapidly transforming nation. We, as a people, had grown up under her watchful eye, a collective experience that shaped our identity. The grief was genuine, widespread and deeply felt, yet there was also an undeniable sense of anticipation, a feeling that an era, a truly monumental era, had finally closed. The Victorian age, with its paradoxes wrapped in a bustle, and its enigma shrouded in smog, was officially over. And who was next to take the throne? None other than her eldest son, Prince Albert Edward, the once rebellious, pleasure-loving Bertie. He had chafed under his mother's shadow for decades, denied meaningful responsibility, often criticised for his fast lifestyle. Now, at the age of 59, he was finally King Edward VII. His accession marked not just a change of monarch, but a seismic shift in national character. The sombre, moralistic tone of the Victorian court, with its emphasis on duty and decorum, was swiftly replaced by Edward's more relaxed, cosmopolitan, and distinctly pleasure-seeking approach. The Edwardian era, which we will explore next, would be a brief but glittering interlude, a final golden afternoon before the shadows of global conflict began to lengthen. So what do we make of this colossal span of history, this Victorian era? It was unequivocally the crucible where the modern world was forged. It gave us the railway, the telegraph, the sewer system, the concept of public health. It expanded the empire to its greatest extent, while simultaneously wrestling with the moral ambiguities of that expansion. It championed scientific progress and industrial innovation, yet grappled with the social upheaval and unimaginable squalor these forces unleashed. It was an age of profound morality and rampant hypocrisy, of rigid class structures and nascent social reform, of individual enterprise and growing collective consciousness. We began with a young, inexperienced queen asserting her will, and we end with an aging matriarch, a symbol of continuity passing the torch to a new, very different century. The Victorians bequeathed us a legacy of innovation and exploitation, of progress and poverty, of unshakable faith and gnawing doubt. They built the foundations of the world we inhabit today, and in doing so they left us with enduring questions about progress, power, and what it truly means to be a modern nation. Their story, as we have seen, is not just a history of the past, but a mirror reflecting the complexities of our own present. And with the dawn of the Edwardian age, a new chapter, both exhilarating and foreboding, was about to begin. The hush that fell over the nation on January 2nd, 1901, was unlike any Britain had ever known. It wasn't merely the quiet of mourning, though that was profound. It was the silence of an era drawing its final rattling breath. Queen Victoria, the constant, the immovable, the very embodiment of an age, was gone. For 63 years her presence had been the bedrock of British life, a steadfast anchor in a sea of unprecedented change. And now, just like that, the anchor had been raised. What did it mean, we ask ourselves, for a nation to lose its matriarch after such an unimaginable span? It was more than a change of monarch. It was a seismic shift in the collective psyche, a turning of the page so monumental it felt like the very air had altered. We had lived under Victoria for so long, had come to associate her with everything from moral rectitude to imperial might, that her passing left a void both terrifying and exhilarating. The Victorian era, that grand, contradictory crucible of an age, was officially closed. The future, shimmering and uncertain, beckoned. And who was to lead us into this brave new world? None other than the man who had waited his entire life for this moment, Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, now King Edward VII. For nearly 6 decades he had been Bertie, the perpetually overlooked, the frequently criticised, the son forever in the shadow of his formidable mother and his sainted father. Now, at 59 years old, the longest-serving heir apparent in British history finally had his turn. And oh, what a change it was. Imagine the stark contrast from the black-clad widow of Windsor, shrouded in perpetual grief and moral austerity, to a monarch known for his bon vivant lifestyle, his love of racing, hunting, good food, and, dare we say, a rather extensive network of female companions. Bertie, the fast prince, the man who had chafed under his mother's strictures and his father's impossibly high standards, was now king. It was a transition from an era defined by duty, decorum, and often dour piety, to one that, at least on the surface, promised a little more pleasure, a little more panache, and a lot more public visibility for the royal family. Edward VII, you see, was a man of the world, fluent in French and German, a seasoned traveller, and possessing a natural charm that could disarm even the most hardened politician. He brought a cosmopolitan flair to the throne that Victoria, in her later years, had largely eschewed. Where Victoria had retreated to Osborne and Balmoral, Edward embraced London, Paris, and the European capitals. He was, in many ways, the quintessential Edwardian gentleman, portly, impeccably dressed, a connoisseur of the finer things and utterly at ease in high society. His reign, though comparatively brief, would become synonymous with the distinct period known as the Edwardian Era, a fascinating, glittering, and ultimately fleeting interlude between the long Victorian age and the cataclysm of the First World War. His accession was met with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief, because after decades of the Queen's seclusion, there was a palpable desire for a more active, visible monarch. Edward, with his love of public ceremony and his genuine enjoyment of social engagements, was perfectly suited to this. He understood the power of spectacle, the importance of being seen, of connecting with the public in a way his mother, post-Albert, simply couldn't or wouldn't. He made state visits, hosted lavish banquets, and revitalized the court, transforming it from a sombre, almost puritanical institution into a vibrant centre of social and diplomatic life. But apprehension lingered too. Would this pleasure-loving king be able to handle the immense responsibilities of the crown? Would his notoriously indiscreet private life undermine the moral authority of the monarchy that Victoria had so painstakingly rebuilt? We watched with bated breath, you and I, as Edward navigated these expectations. And what we saw was a king who, despite his personal indulgences, possessed a surprisingly astute political mind and a genuine commitment to his role. He was, in the words of one contemporary, a monarch who knew how to be a king without being a prig. He might have enjoyed the good life, but he took his duties seriously, particularly in foreign policy, where his personal relationships with European monarchs earned him the affectionate, if somewhat exaggerated, title of Uncle of Europe. The Edwardian era, which now truly began, felt like a collective sigh of relief, a loosening of the corset strings after decades of Victorian tightness. The rigid moral codes didn't vanish overnight, of course. Society doesn't change that quickly. But there was a distinct sense of liberation, a willingness to embrace modernity with a little more zest. Fashion grew more flamboyant, with women's silhouettes becoming more flowing and less restrictive than the crinolines and bustles of earlier decades. The arts too began to break free from Victorian earnestness, with movements like Art Nouveau embracing organic forms and decorative beauty. Technology, which had been a hallmark of the Victorian age, continued its relentless march forward, but with a new sense of acceleration. The motor car, once a quirky novelty, became a symbol of status and speed. Telephones were no longer just for businesses, slowly making their way into private homes. Electric lights began to banish the gas lamps, literally and figuratively illuminating the path to a new century. Cinema, still in its infancy, offered glimpses of a world moving at a dizzying pace. It was a time of unprecedented optimism, a belief that progress was inevitable, that the future was bright and boundless. Yet underneath the glittering surface of Edwardian society, the deep-seated problems of the Victorian era continued to fester. The vast British Empire, now at its zenith, still grappled with the moral and practical challenges of governing a quarter of the globe. The scars of the Second Boer War, which had ended just 2 years after Edward's accession, were still fresh, exposing the brutal realities of imperialism and fueling anti-imperialist sentiment at home. Social inequalities, though somewhat mitigated by nascent welfare reforms, remained stark. The glittering West End still cast its shadow over disease-ridden slums, and the working classes continued their struggle for better conditions and greater political representation, with the burgeoning Labour Party gaining ground. This was also the era when the fight for women's suffrage truly exploded onto the national stage. No longer content with polite petitions, the suffragettes, led by figures like Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, adopted more militant tactics, shaking the foundations of a patriarchal society that still clung to Victorian notions of women's proper place. Their cries for votes for women became an undeniable soundtrack to the era, a powerful reminder that not all was well in the seemingly serene Edwardian garden. So while the Victorian era officially ended with Victoria's death, its legacy was far from over. Edward VII's reign, though distinct in its style and atmosphere, was built upon the foundations laid by his mother and father. It was a period of transition, a bridge between two worlds, the staid, moralistic 19th century and the tumultuous, rapidly modernising 20th. We saw a relaxation of social strictures, a more open and cosmopolitan court, and a king who brought a much-needed human touch back to the monarchy. But we also saw the continuation of profound social challenges, the increasing tensions of empire, and the growing clouds of international rivalry that would ultimately plunge Europe and the world into an unimaginable conflict. The Victorian age had truly passed, but its echoes, its lessons, and its unresolved questions would continue to shape the destiny of Britain and the world for decades to come. And it is into this fascinating, vibrant, and ultimately precarious Edwardian world that we now fully step.